right. Hi, guys. I'm so excited to be here and to see you both.
Hello, everyone.
So I'm really excited today that Shivani Sud is joining us to talk about her recent research on photographs of the plague. Is that right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And we'll talk about, other diseased bodies and such as well. But before we do, I just want to tell you that today I actually have a tea bowl. I'm very excited about.
Yeah.
I know. I'm still here in what feels like rural Minnesota. I'm in Afton, Minnesota, along the St. Croix River, which is incredibly beautiful. Staying at a friend of a friend's house. But I did manage to get one of my tea bowls. So even though I'm drinking tension tamer tea because it's just been one of those days, I do have this, which is made by this amazing potter named Cristin, who's in Portland, Oregon. And
any relation to Carol?
To whom?
Carol Baskin?
I don't know. Who is that?
You don't want to know.
It's fine. That's fine. Keep going.
Okay, now I'm gonna have to Google this person afterwards. But no, I don't think so. But Chris he does amazing work with porcelain. I can't turn it upside down to show you the foot because it has tea in it. But he does, this is like thick porcelain that he has fired with soda ash and I think wood ash. It's really cool. So I'm happy to have that. What are you guys drinking?
I'm drinking a oolong. Actually, I drink a lot. This oolong tea, I obviously cannot show you what's inside. Is a very popular oolong from Taiwan, the High Mountain oolong.
Did you say High Mountain?
Yeah, High Mountain oolong, because they grow in a very sort of high.
What happens if the higher the altitude? How does that change the tea in terms of the growing?
I don't know.
But it makes it somehow special.
Right.
Low mountain is nice.
I think it's a special because Taiwan has a lot of sort of this sort of hilly mountains, and they're really sort of ideal for this type of tea, this type of oolong that's sort of slightly fermented, right? Oolong because oolong is slightly fermented more so than green tea. So they have actually this beautiful cluster, very sort of tight cluster of like leaves that sort of opens up when you sort of put in water, and there's a really wonderful floral scent to it. And the teacup that I'm drinking, we don't have to talk about our teacups.
We should definitely talk about our teacups if you want.
They're from early 20th century, are these sort of mass-produced type of teacup, although they're all individually made by hand of so-called a rice grain pattern. As you can sort of see, they are sort of transparent because there's only glaze. They will puncture holes in it, and then you only have glaze on between sort of this wonderful transparency.
I see, so the glaze is actually filling in the hole.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, it's cool too to think, because Chris also has, I don't know if you can see like the little bumps. Can you see the bumps? Which is different from that. I think he must have added some kind of gritty material into the porcelain when he was wedging it, and then or when he was throwing it, because it has all this texture in it, which kind of looks like that, but in a different way. Two ways to do porcelain, I guess.
Yes.
Shivani. How about you, Shivani? What are you drinking?
I am drinking masala chai.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I actually, when I was living in India during fieldwork last year, I got used to making it, the traditional way with over a stove with loose leaf black tea and lots of milk and spices, and so it just it makes this like very creamy, rich, fragrant tea.
So how much milk do you do? Like 50% milk, 50% water, or all milk?
I do less milk. I do less than that, but I guess I do it more based off of the color. You can see it's not super brown. What I love about chai is that everyone has their own version. And so I do a mix of like dry spices, cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, black pepper. But if I'm like feeling up to it, then I'll do fresh ginger, or even fresh mint. And then there's also sorts of like regional variations with chai. So my sister-in-law family's from Gujarat, and they add fresh lemongrass to it, which is really delicious.
Oh, that's amazing.
I'm gonna get a recipe from that.
Oh, and my mom actually grinds up the spices and keeps it in a little jar.
Do you put it in a little packet? sort of pack it to sort of, or do you just sprinkle in the tea?
It's like, yeah, I just sprinkle it on top, or I'll just add the whole spices because I'm lazy, but and then strain it.
Good.
Yeah.
They have more flavor, don't they?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really excited about this topic, and I'm so excited, Shivani, to hear about your work. So I think we should just get right into it. Do you wanna start?
Yes. So what I'm presenting today is my research. This was recently published in the Getty Research Journal, and I guess I want to start with some background of how I got interested in this topic years ago when I was writing my master's thesis. And I came across this album of photographs at the Getty Research Institute, and it held photographs of the bubonic plague when it broke out in Bombay in 1896. And most of my friends and relatives in India were not aware of this history, and I wasn't either. And so I wanted to explore this history further. And there were two things that were really fascinating for me about this history. One is that this was a global pandemic. So it had spread through Yunnan province in southwestern China and to Hong Kong. And from there, it spread through other parts of the world through sea trade. And it had reached the British port city of Bombay in 1896, and then it spread through the entire Indian subcontinent. And so you can see from this map also that it spread from China to the US, India to Madagascar, Europe to South America. So it primarily seems to be spreading through trade routes, and especially imperial trade routes. And then the second reason that I was interested in this project was because the third plague pandemic, the sort of the third pandemic of the bubonic plague, it was the first pandemic to be captured through the lens of the camera, because photography had developed in the 1840s. And so this is one of the earliest photographic documentations of an epidemic in India, but most likely other countries as well. And so then I sort of asked myself, well, with the development of photography, how was disease being visualized? What do these photographs tell us about, ideas about disease and healthcare and the environment at this time? What is the relationship between epidemiology and epidemic photography? And I just wanted to bring up this example because right away we can see that, so this is what we would call medical photography or clinical medical photography. And we can see that the photographs from the Bombay photo album are doing something different. These photographs were taken by a British military officer and a British commercial photographer. And they had been commissioned by the Bombay Plague Committee. And so what these photographs seem to be doing is documenting the broad ecology of the disease. So documenting sites of outbreak, modes of transmission, and I think most importantly, it's documenting the colonial state's efforts, the preventative measures that they're taking to eradicate the plague. And so you can see here that, it shows the cleaning of streets, hospitals, testing, burials. So by carefully studying these photographs, I think they can tell us a lot about the ways in which the colonial state was conceptualizing disease at this time. So for instance, this photograph, it shows a residential colony that has been contaminated by the plague, and it shows how the colonial state is cleansing these infected areas with water. And it's important to note that the photographs in the album only focus on Indian housing settlements, not European residential areas. Even though, of course, Europeans were affected by the plague, they're not going to want to show that, right? They want to show that the disease is emerging from the local population itself. And it's also important to note the use of water, possibly seawater. So colonial officials believed in the kind of efficacious qualities of water in being able to clean, especially seawater. And 3 million gallons of salt water were actually being flushed through Bombay's drains and sewage systems by the end of the 19th century in order to clean these, essentially. So this reveals something then very fundamental about colonial understanding of disease at that time. So in London, British health officials had accepted the new germ theory of disease, right? The idea that diseases develop through the spread of pathogens. But in the colony, British health officials and colonial administrators, they refused to believe that. They wanted to believe that it was the unsanitary and climatic factors that enabled diseases to thrive. And so this is really important because then the colonial state is essentially suggesting that it's the Indian environment that's responsible for disease, that the Indian environment itself is pathogenic. And it's able to sort of place that blame, right? And specifically, colonial officials believed that diseases were caused by poor ventilation created by overcrowding within dwellings, especially within the new low-cost urban housing settlements that had been built in Bombay to accommodate the influx of migrant workers who were coming to Bombay to work in the city's mills, especially cotton mills. And so for me, this history has never been more relevant than it is today. If we think about the environmental consequences of modernization and urbanization, or even, so whether it's, the lead contaminated water in Flint, Michigan, or communities affected by oil pipelines, or even those who are being affected the most by COVID-19 today, it is usually, the poor and the working class who are disproportionately affected by toxic contamination and diseases and poor living conditions than, the privileged and the wealthy. In Bombay during the plague pandemic, it was the urban poor and the working class, specifically migrant workers, who were the most severely affected by the plague, but at the same time, they were also seen as the very vector of the disease. And for me, this photograph, visually, it is, I find it's visually a very striking photograph, but it also, I was struck by, recently I saw this photograph, I just came across this image in a news article, and I was struck by the similarities between the two. The use of the pump, this one I think it's a pump to spray chemical, a kind of chemical solution onto the neighborhood. And I was just immediately reminded of this 19th century photograph that I had spent so much time studying. And these photographs, so going back to this idea that disease is spread within, humid, dark, contained spaces, which also has, of course, a lot of, symbolic resonances. In these photographs, we can see that the homes have been unroofed to allow sunlight and air into the space. And this kind of environmentalist notion of disease, it had a huge impact on Bombay's urban design and city planning. So you can see here that in response to the plague epidemic, certain roads were constructed in the early 20th century to ventilate the city with breezes from the sea. And so these projects were meant to kind of circulate fresh air in the city. And it's a fascinating history, and we don't really have that much time to get into it, but it leads to the development of suburbs and wide boulevards and parks that shape the design of the city today. So far from admitting their failures in controlling the plague epidemic, the British used visual materials as propaganda to show the world how they were actually combating the disease. So images were circulated in newspapers that not only contributed to this idea of, you know, India as supposedly a place of disease and chaos, but also kind of reinforced the need for colonial intervention. Here are some postcards that highlight the role of European doctors in bringing, you know, supposedly bringing modern medicine to India. But the fact is that the plague epidemic spread for about 18 years until finally subsiding in 1914. And now look, when I look back at my research, I find that history is repeating itself in so many ways. From, you know, the separation of hospital wards based on religion and caste, the mass migration of migrant workers from major cities, which should sound familiar to anyone who's watching the news in India currently. In the span of 4 months, nearly half of Bombay's population left the city during the plague epidemic. And this wasn't necessarily in response to the disease itself, but it was in response to the very harsh actions of the government. And also there was a lot of mistrust and anxiety over medical professionals and hospitals. And there was an incident where 3 brothers, shown here on the top left, they actually attacked and killed 2 British officers. So just a lot of anxiety and distrust amongst the local population. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this was a global pandemic, so it led to a global photographic archive. This on the top left is a photograph from Hong Kong, and then on the bottom right, this is a photograph of Honolulu's Chinatown, which was set fire by public health officials. And as the plague spread through the world, so did you know, visual materials. And with those visual materials, so did fear and xenophobia. So historically, epidemics such as the plague and SARS have been accompanied by a wave of racism and specifically anti-Chinese sentiment, which can be seen in this trade card from 1883 here on the top left. And I wanted to juxtapose this image with the restaging of the contemporary artist Lygia Pape, her performance piece Divisor, which took place in Hong Kong. And for me, her work can be seen as literally embodying the social fabric that we're all a part of. And it sort of questions the boundaries that humans create between themselves, you know, the physical, social, economic divisions between people that become even more apparent during times of crises. And both of these artworks are from an exhibition called a Journal of the Plague Year that took place in, well, it was a traveling exhibition. So it traveled from Hong Kong to San Francisco in 2015. And I had the opportunity to see it. So I think that exhibition was organized in response to the SARS epidemic, but the 2003 SARS epidemic, but there was visual materials from different time periods, and contemporary artists it focused mostly on the work of contemporary artists that were responding to this really violent history. And I just want to end with this slide, just to highlight the incredible amount of research that's being done on representations of the third pandemic. And this is the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, or CRASH, at the University of Cambridge, and they've started this research initiative, and with projects from a global perspective. And here I just offered a kind of micro history, but I would really recommend, if anyone's interested in learning more, to check out their this project. Yeah. So I'll end there, and then we can open up the conversation.
All right. So that was totally fascinating, Shivani. Thank you so much. I mean, it's so interesting. I love looking at late 19th century photographs, especially in India, or of India. And I can absolutely see how these were used as kind of colonial propaganda to justify colonial rule. The other thing that was sort of striking to me with that image of the flushing engine, that sort of one image of the guy spraying the housing sort of complex with the hose, is that it seems like the photographs also about technology, right? About this sort of sort of showing off maybe technological advancements or access to technology. I mean, I don't know how difficult or sort of what's involved technologically in terms of being able to corral seawater and pump it through hoses to be able to use it in putting out fires. But that was sort of also something that struck me. In addition to showing how clean and sort of focused on, hygienic healthcare the British are, it also seems like there's a little bit of flexing, maybe some industrial muscles there, perhaps.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's such a there's so much to unpack in that image. What's interesting is that the pumping of water, it actually ended up spreading the disease even more. So it wasn't effective, but it was. But I think the British definitely, that was something that they very much promoted. And then thinking of photography also as this kind of technological apparatus, it is interesting how all of these things come together in that sense. And for me, it's also, what's interesting is this kind of like disjuncture between metropolitan science and colonial science, and how those diverge in very interesting ways. Yeah.
I mean, because for me, so much of that is also, the clear appropriation of fire engines is also to show off the preparedness of a city infrastructure, right? Of the forces, of the fire sort of forces, where, they are, comparable in 19th century in America. These are pride and joy of a city. So I think that part of deliberately showing off these sort of civic and civic and structure in municipal sort of services is also the goal of these photographs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It also seems like there's an interesting juxtaposition too, though, with that one photograph of the Hindu funeral pyre, right? That it's also, it's showing sort of kind of European or British ways, or colonial government ways of thinking about healthcare and hygiene, but then it's also including these kinds of images, which I imagine for the British public, when it was reproduced in that other publication, sort of underscores these Orientalist ideas about sort of native populations and native practices.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're so organized. That's what I find it fascinating, right? Those funeral pyres are it looks like, I don't think it's on the side of the street, but it looks like they're somewhere in an urban setting rather than rural or next to a river, right? So, I mean, it is sort of orientalizing in sort of these type of expected behavior for the colonized subject, but it is also in a way they have modernized this sort of set of behavior as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, there was a lot of discourse about the kind of how sort of local residents were not able to understand what British medical officers were doing, or their sort of reliance on indigenous medicine or indigenous methods of healthcare, and this kind of again this kind of divergence between like what the different ways of thinking about the body and healthcare and disease. So it is, there's just so many different layers here and so many different conflicts.
Have you found other albums like this, or is this unique in, I mean, it's sort of hard to make generalizations about 19th century photo albums because they kind of crop up in all sorts of places, but other than the one that was republished, that photograph of the funeral pyre that was republished in a periodical, have you found, like, does the British Library have albums like this? Are there other albums and collections that you found that similarly document the plague?
Yeah, so this was something actually that I didn't have that much time to go into, but this photo album, it's part of a larger set of photographs that were then organized into multiple albums. And then those albums were distributed to British officers, like the director of the hospital in Bombay. And I recently found one in the private collection of the Duke of Edinburgh. So yeah, it's really interesting. Almost like as souvenirs, and so there's an album in the Wellcome collection in London, in the British Library, and at the Getty Research Institute. But then there's also the Getty Research Institute also has a photo album from Pune, the nearby city of Pune, and those photographs were taken by a doctor. And they're actually very different because they focus more on the symptoms of disease. They're sort of close-ups of people who are infected, and I guess those could be classified more as conventional medical photography. Yeah. So just depending on who's taking the photograph also.
Well, but I think it's also interesting to think about then, to think about the different approaches and different sort of views, where doctor is very much about observing the sort of the medical sort of the physical manifestations of the disease. The government, for the purpose, is sort of having this sort of distance approach, this distant approach that is meant to see the larger patterns and structures within society.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why a comparative project would be so interesting, just to think about the different ways in which the pandemic is being documented in different countries at the time.
Well, also it seems like it'd be interesting to think, is there something unique about the medium of photography that allows for this particular kind of documentation, or are there other similar kinds of pandemics or other kinds of sort of medical crises that are being documented in other mediums at different points in time?
Right, and certainly photography is being used in different ways. There are also medical journals that have photographs that are printed, and those are mostly focused on the research side of the plague. With you have like European scientists who are looking through a microscope, and so those are different. And there are a couple actually. They were reproduced in this album. They weren't taken by the same photographers of the album, but they were included in the album to show that aspect as well.
And to add on to that, there are examples in China earlier, before photography, that there were medical paintings that were done at the commission of Christian sort of missionary doctors who wanted the painters to capture the most physically sort of manifested disease, with people with large tumors, and to sort of illustrate the diseased bodies of Chinese people, especially in southern China, as a way to not only to demonstrate the superiority of Western medicine, but also Christianity, but also as a way to bring back home to Connecticut. This doctor came from, Peter Parker was from Connecticut, and most of the paintings are now at Yale Medical Library, to demonstrate and use them as fundraising tools to continue to help support the medical missions.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking also of just the kind of perceived indexicality of photographs and how it's a sort of unique place within medical science and sort of documentation.
I mean, I think that also shows, you know, painting can do something very different where I've seen medical paintings where they'll actually show, you know, the interior of the arm. And in that way, you're actually able to like capture the detail that you want to capture. And with photography, and again, I think going back to what you were saying about technology and how it's being developed and used, a decade before the production of this album, bacteriological photomicrography had developed, which is basically microscopic images of bacteria. So then, you know, one can study the actual physical configuration of germs. So that also is, you know, different kind of, it's sort of like a technology of vision that's allowing you to see something very different, you know, that one can't really see with the naked eye. And so with these kinds of photographs, then it's like, how are they actually visualizing the disease? They are focusing on more of the preventative measures, and you can't really see the disease. You can't really see what's happening with their efforts. You know, and it seems like actually there wasn't really any sort of practical use for these photographs, because in the medical journals that I've been studying, I haven't found any reference to these albums or photographs.
Totally fascinating. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we should also,
this is
we forgot to introduce where we are.
Yeah, totally. Everyone knows I'm in, you know,
somewhere in Minnesota.
River in Minnesota. Trying to get back to DC at some point, but we'll figure out how that happens.
I'm in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, right after a thunder and hail storm. So I'm glad that there's no noise distraction in the background, and electricity is still on. So
I'm in Orange County. I'm actually in my childhood home right now with my dad and my partner, because I'm sort of in this weird limbo state right now. I just came back from field work at the end of December, and glad to be home. And then at one point, my partner and I are hoping to move to New York, and we were supposed to get married too at some point this year. We were supposed to, but we'll see what happens. But for now, we're here.
Well, if you do a Zoom wedding, we can all be there.
Ooh,
that's true. That's true.
Fun. Keep your costs down.
Yeah.
Well, Shivani, thank you so much for sharing your work
great.
with us. This is really wonderful. And and for, you know, whoever happens to be watching, stay tuned. Next week, we've got another special guest, Elaine Yau. We're very excited about that. And yeah, I hope you all, William, Shivani, I hope you continue to stay healthy and be well. And it's great to see you guys.
Yeah. See you next week.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I love watching every week. I feel like I'm part of the conversation. I'm so isolated. It's nice to have that.
I know. Well, thank you.
Go. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.